She thought she had left her painful past behind, but in one cruel moment, it was thrown back in her face. Labeled as not wife material because of choices she never fully controlled, her worth was reduced to whispers, rumors, and scars she had tried so hard to heal from. Love, the very thing she believed would finally set her free, became another weapon used against her. This isn't just a story of rejection, it's a journey through betrayal, prejudice, and the haunting weight of a past that refused to let go. From the outside, her life seemed steady, even ordinary. She worked hard, carried herself with quiet grace, and moved through each day as though she had finally found peace. Yet beneath that calm surface lived a history carved with scars no one could see. Her past was not something she advertised, nor something she wanted sympathy for. It was a part of her, a shadow that followed silently behind every step, a reminder that survival had never been easy and judgment never far away. She had grown up in a neighborhood where people carried labels like second skin. Once a reputation was etched, it stayed, no matter how much one changed, no matter how far one tried to run. For her, those labels had been cruel. People remembered her not for her resilience, her intelligence, or her unshakable spirit, but for the mistakes of her youth, mistakes shaped less by choice and more by circumstances she couldn't control. Poverty, instability, and betrayal had forced her into decisions that would later define her unfairly in the eyes of others. As she entered adulthood, she fought to reinvent herself. Education became her refuge, work her salvation. She immersed herself in building a career, creating a stable foundation where once there had been chaos. To outsiders, she was successful, independent, strong, even admirable. But no matter how polished the exterior, she often felt the sting of unspoken judgment. At family gatherings, glances lingered a little too long. In social spaces, whispers sometimes floated behind her back, and though she tried to ignore them, she always felt the weight of being seen as someone tainted by a story others thought they knew. Despite this, she believed in love. She believed that someday someone would look past the shadows of her past and see her for the woman she had become. Love, to her, was not just romance. It was redemption, acceptance, and the chance to finally breathe without fear of judgment. For years she guarded her heart, wary of being hurt again, but when she met him, she allowed herself to hope. He came into her life not as a whirlwind, but as a steady presence, the kind of person who made the world feel safe. He seemed different from the others, uninterested in gossip or appearances. His charm was quiet, grounded in patience and a warmth that seemed to invite trust. She found herself opening up in ways she had never dared before. For once, she felt seen, not as the girl with a broken past, but as the woman she was striving to be. With him, she allowed herself to dream. She imagined building a future where her past no longer defined her. She pictured a home filled with laughter, children running through its hallways, and the quiet comfort of knowing she was loved despite everything. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep her heart beating a little lighter. But life has a cruel way of testing those who dare to hope. The more serious their relationship became, the more her past returned in whispers and insinuations. Old acquaintances resurfaced, weaving stories of who she once was, tainting her present with echoes of shame. She noticed the shift, friends of his asking questions laced with hidden meaning, family members scrutinizing her with polite but cold smiles. Each encounter left her shaken, as though the walls she had built so carefully were crumbling again. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of her own insecurities. But the tension was real, growing like a shadow between them. She felt it in the pauses that lingered too long, in the way his eyes sometimes carried questions he didn't voice. And though he never said a word, she sensed the doubt creeping in, fed by those who judged her without ever truly knowing her. Yet she carried on, determined not to let her past steal the happiness she was beginning to taste. She gave herself to the relationship fully, investing time, energy, and vulnerability. She wanted to prove, not just to him but to herself, that she was worthy of love. Every sacrifice, every effort was a silent plea. See me for who I am now, not for who I was then. But in the world she lived in, forgiveness was scarce and memory was selective. People clung to the worst parts of someone's history, polishing them like weapons, ready to strike whenever envy or prejudice demanded. Her story was not of second chances, but of how fragile redemption could be in the eyes of others. The betrayal, when it came, was not sudden. It built itself slowly, brick by brick, until it stood tall and undeniable. She began to notice his withdrawal, the way he no longer looked at her with the same warmth, the way conversations felt emptier, colder. He grew cautious, distant, as though weighing something heavy in silence. And then, without warning, the truth surfaced. Someone had reminded him of her past, dressing it in uglier words than reality, painting her as unworthy, as tainted. Though he hadn't yet spoken the words aloud, she could feel them hovering between them like smoke, not wife material. For her, the phrase was not just a judgment, it was a blade cutting into years of effort, stripping away the dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. It was the cruel reminder that no matter how far she had come, there were always those who would drag her back to where she started. But before that moment shattered her world completely, she still clung to hope. She told herself love was stronger than gossip, that a bond built on trust could withstand the weight of the past. She wanted to believe he would see her truth, the woman she was now, the woman she had become through hardship and survival. What she didn't yet realize was that the greatest betrayal wasn't just in his judgment, it was in the way he allowed others to define her worth. And so, as she stood on the brink of heartbreak, unaware of the storm about to break, her story began to unravel into the kind of tale she had always feared. One where love wasn't enough to protect her, and the ghosts of her past refused to stay buried. The stage was set, the tension rising. What began as hope was about to spiral into devastation, and the woman who thought she had finally escaped her past would soon discover how easily betrayal can rip apart even the most carefully rebuilt life. The whispers grew louder, though never spoken in her presence. They lived in glances exchanged across dinner tables, in the awkward silences that lingered when she entered a room, in the subtle but unmistakable shift in how people regarded her. It was as if every step forward she had taken was being pulled backward by unseen hands, dragging her into a version of herself she had fought desperately to leave behind. At first, she told herself it didn't matter. She had endured worse. Gossip was noise, nothing more. Yet, as the weeks passed, that noise began to shape her reality. Invitations to gatherings became fewer. Friends of his who once greeted her warmly now regarded her with calculated politeness, their smiles laced with suspicion. She felt the walls closing in, each encounter a reminder that acceptance was conditional, fragile, and fleeting. She noticed the change in him most of all. Where once his eyes had sparkled with admiration, now they carried shadows of doubt. He listened too carefully when others spoke, and she could feel him weighing every word. The subtle distance in his touch, the hesitations in his voice, the pauses between conversations, they spoke volumes louder than anything he could say. It was then that she realized betrayal doesn't always announce itself with a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the erosion of trust, in the way love begins to fade beneath the weight of other people's judgments. The injustice was suffocating. She had rebuilt her life from ashes, refusing to be defined by the mistakes or circumstances of her past. Yet here she was, condemned once more, not by her own actions in the present, but by the refusal of others to let her evolve. It was as though redemption was a gift reserved only for a select few, while for people like her, it remained forever out of reach. She remembered the sacrifices she had made, the long hours at work, the nights spent alone in study, the endless effort to become someone she could be proud of. All of it seemed invisible now, overshadowed by a narrative she hadn't written yet was forced to carry. The weight of injustice pressed down on her shoulders, reminding her that in a world obsessed with reputation, truth often mattered less than perception. And still, she loved him. Against her better judgment, against the evidence mounting before her, She clung to the hope that he would rise above the noise. That he would be the one to see her, to defend her, to choose her not in spite of her past, but because of the woman she had become through it. But love, she would soon learn, can falter in the face of fear. He began to withdraw further, and with each step back, she felt her heart unravel. He spent less time with her, offered fewer reassurances, and when he looked at her, there was something in his eyes she couldn't ignore, a calculation, a silent questioning of whether she was worth the battle. The man who had once felt like her safe harbor was becoming another storm she had to weather. It was in those quiet, painful moments that she felt betrayal most deeply. Not in words, not even in actions, but in the absence of what she needed most, unwavering support. Betrayal, she realized, was not only about lies or infidelity, it was about abandonment, about watching someone you love shrink away from you when you need them most. Her world became heavy with silence. Nights stretched longer, days blurred into a haze of doubt, and the future she had once dared to envision began to feel like a cruel mirage. Still, she carried herself with dignity. She refused to let despair consume her, though inside she felt herself breaking piece by piece. The injustice gnawed at her. Men with far darker pasts were celebrated for their redemption arcs, while women like her were branded as unworthy, their scars weaponized against them. It wasn't just betrayal she was fighting, it was a system of judgment rooted in hypocrisy and prejudice. She began to wonder if love was ever truly unconditional, or if it was always bound by silent contracts of reputation, family approval, and the weight of history. The more she questioned, the more she realized that her story was not just her own, it echoed the struggles of countless women who had been measured not by their present, but by their past. And yet, she wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Hope still flickered, fragile but persistent. She wanted to believe that love could still prevail, that he could still stand by her, that she wasn't fighting in vain. But with every passing day, the shadows grew darker, the whispers louder, and the distance between them deeper. The stage was set for a heartbreak she couldn't yet name, but could already feel pressing against her chest. The betrayal was not complete, but it was coming, inevitable as the tide. She could sense it in the way her heart braced itself every time she saw him, as though preparing for a blow she knew she couldn't avoid. This was no longer just a relationship tested by gossip. It was becoming a fight for her dignity, her identity, and the right to be seen as worthy of love. And in that fight, she was standing increasingly alone. The moment came not as an explosion, but as a slow collapse, the kind that offers no mercy. By the time she realized what was happening, the ground had already been pulled from beneath her. He had grown so distant that silence had replaced conversation, indifference had replaced warmth. The man who once made her feel like she was worth fighting for now stood on the other side of an invisible line, one he refused to cross again. She felt it in his absence more than his presence, in the way he no longer sought her company, in the way he seemed to exist in a different orbit entirely. And then the words were spoken, the ones she had sensed lingering for weeks, maybe months. Though they came without anger, they cut deeper than any shouted insult could. He said she was not wife material. He said her past was too heavy, that his family could never accept her, that love wasn't enough to erase what others believed about her. It was as though her very soul had been stripped bare. Every sacrifice, every effort to build a new life, every step she had taken toward healing. It all crumbled under the weight of that single judgment. Not wife material. The phrase was more than rejection. It was condemnation, a dismissal of her humanity, a cruel reminder that to the world she was still the sum of her scars. The betrayal wasn't just in his words, but in what they revealed. He had never truly seen her. He had seen the version of her that fit his image of redemption, but when confronted with the messy, complicated truth of her history, he faltered. He allowed others to dictate her worth, allowed whispers to shape his judgment, allowed cowardice to replace love. She remembered the nights she had shared her vulnerabilities with him, the trust she had given him so completely. She had let him see the cracks in her armor, believing he would hold her gently, that he would honor her courage. Instead, He had taken her openness and turned it into ammunition, proof of why she could never be the woman he wanted to stand beside. The devastation was unbearable. It wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the shattering of hope itself. She had believed in him, believed in love, believed in the possibility of finally outrunning her past. Now all of that lay in ruins. But heartbreak has a way of sharpening truths, of forcing clarity where once there was illusion. As she sat in the wreckage of her dreams, she realized the betrayal went beyond him. It was a reflection of a society that demanded perfection from women while excusing flaws in men. A society that clung to the past as a weapon, refusing to acknowledge growth, change, or resilience. He wasn't the first to judge her, but his betrayal stung the most because he had promised, without words, but through actions, that he was different. That promise had given her courage to hope, and now that hope was poisoned. She replayed his words in her mind, each repetition heavier than the last. Not wife material. Not worthy. Not enough. These were not just his words, they were echoes of every voice that had ever tried to reduce her to the mistakes of her past. He had simply confirmed what others had long whispered. And yet, within that crushing pain, something unexpected began to stir. Anger, not wild, destructive anger, but a quiet, burning kind. A refusal to let this betrayal define her yet again. She had been broken before, and each time she had rebuilt herself. This time would be no different. Still, the immediate aftermath was suffocating. She withdrew from the world, retreating into herself, reliving every detail of their unraveling. The house felt emptier, the streets lonelier, the days longer. She carried the shame like a cloak, feeling as though everyone could see the rejection imprinted on her skin. Her heart ached with the cruelty of it all. That love, which she had held as sacred, could be so conditional, so fragile, so easily dismantled by judgment. She thought about the younger version of herself, the girl who had once believed she was destined only for pain, who had fought tooth and nail to carve out a better life. Would that girl have been surprised by this betrayal? Perhaps not. But the woman she had become, the woman who had dared to dream of a future filled with acceptance, felt gutted by the reminder that no amount of change could erase the prejudice of others. Still, there was no undoing it. The betrayal had landed. The judgment had been passed. And she was left alone, standing in the ruins of love, forced to confront the harsh reality that sometimes even the most sincere hopes end in heartbreak. Yet within that heartbreak, something deeper took root. She began to see his rejection not as a reflection of her worth, but of his weakness. He had failed, not her. He had failed to see the strength in her survival, the beauty in her resilience, the dignity in her transformation. He had chosen the comfort of conformity over the courage of love. And in that choice, he revealed who he truly was. The climax of her story was not just the heartbreak itself, but the revelation that betrayal does not destroy unless you let it. Betrayal exposes truths, ugly truths about others, painful truths about society, and sometimes even uncomfortable truths about ourselves. In this moment, she saw all of it clearly. And while clarity did not heal the wound, it lit a path forward. The woman who had once been shattered by judgment would rise again, though the scar of his words would remain. Not wife material. The phrase would echo in her mind for years to come, but not as the curse he intended. Instead, it would become a reminder of how deeply flawed people's measures of worth can be, and how dangerous it is to let others dictate your value. What he had meant as condemnation would, in time, become her fuel. But for now, she sat in the storm of her heartbreak, letting the pain wash over her, knowing that on the other side of devastation lies something far stronger: survival. Heartbreak lingers long after the words are spoken. In the weeks that followed, she carried his rejection like a wound that refused to close. Everyday tasks became heavier, waking up, walking into work, pretending the world had not caved in around her. But perhaps the hardest part was silence, the absence of his presence, the quiet void where once there had been laughter, warmth, and the fragile comfort of hope. She replayed the moments leading up to the end again and again, searching for signs she might have missed, wondering if she had been foolish to believe in him at all. Each memory felt like a betrayal in itself, because they no longer carried the tenderness she once believed in. Instead, they became proof of her misplaced trust. And yet, even as grief consumed her, another voice slowly began to emerge within. A voice that reminded her of all the storms she had weathered before. This was not the first time she had been broken, though it cut more deeply than most. She had rebuilt herself from ashes before, and though the pain screamed that she couldn't, she knew in time she would do it again. In the quiet, she came to a realization. His judgment had never truly been about her. It was about him, his fear of standing against others, his weakness in letting whispers decide for him, his inability to love unconditionally. For a while, she had mistaken his admiration for strength, but the truth revealed itself in the end. A love that cannot withstand the weight of truth is not love at all, it is illusion. With that understanding, her shame began to loosen its grip. She had spent so long believing her past defined her worth, but in the aftermath of betrayal, she began to see things differently. Her past was not a stain, it was proof of survival. Every mistake, every hardship, every scar told the story of a woman who had endured. The very things that others used to condemn her were the same things that made her strong, compassionate, and real. Slowly, she shifted her focus away from him and onto herself. She poured her energy back into her work, into her passions, into the people who had stood by her without judgment. The more she did, the more she realized that she had been giving too much power to those who never deserved it. Her worth had never been theirs to decide. The injustice of it all still stung. She thought often about how women are measured differently, how redemption is often celebrated for men while withheld from women. A man with a troubled past is painted as reformed, but a woman with scars is branded unworthy. That double standard burned within her, but rather than letting it destroy her, she let it sharpen her clarity. She would not be silent about it anymore. She began to write, at first in private journals, then in small pieces she shared anonymously online. Her words carried the weight of her experiences, the pain of betrayal, and the resilience of survival. To her surprise, others resonated. Women she had never met reached out, confessing their own stories of judgment and rejection. She realized she was not alone. Her pain was part of a larger narrative, one woven through countless lives silenced by shame. And so, she transformed her heartbreak into purpose. She became a voice for others, using her story to shed light on the injustices so often hidden behind closed doors. Each time she spoke her truth, the phrase that had once haunted her, "not wife material," lost a little more of its power. What once had been a dagger now became a banner, a challenge to anyone who dared to measure her worth against their narrow standards. Healing did not come quickly. Nights were still heavy, memories still sharp. But with time, the ache softened into something else, strength. She realized she no longer craved his approval, no longer longed for the love that had betrayed her. She had found something far more enduring: her own acceptance. The true resolution of her story was not in winning him back, nor in proving herself to those who judged her. It was in recognizing that she never needed their validation in the first place. She was not defined by their whispers or their labels. She was defined by her survival, her growth, her unyielding refusal to stay broken. When she looked back at the woman who had first dared to hope for love, she did not see a fool. She saw courage. Because it takes courage to trust, to open your heart after it has been scarred. And it takes even greater courage to rise again when that trust is shattered. Her story became more than her own. It became a reflection of every person who has ever been told they are not enough because of a past they cannot change. It became a reminder that betrayal, no matter how devastating, cannot erase the truth of who you are. And in sharing her truth, she left her audience, those listening to her story, those reading her words, with a question that demanded reflection. How many of us have judged someone not by who they are now, but by the shadow of who they once were? And how many of us, if we were judged the same way, would ever be deemed enough? Perhaps the real betrayal is not in what he said to her, but in the way society continues to fail those who fight hardest to rise from their past. So, when you hear her story, when you feel the weight of her heartbreak and the strength of her survival, ask yourself, what defines a person's worth, the mistakes that once broke them, or the resilience that carried them forward? Because maybe the greatest revenge against betrayal is not bitterness, not even forgiveness, but living a life so unapologetically true to yourself that no label, no judgment, no whispered condemnation can ever break you again.